This is going to get a bit rambly. I have a lot to say about this, and I know I'm going to catch some flack for this one. But in a general sense, it's true. I think World of Warcraft is a lot less toxic than people make it out to be. Now, that is definitely not to say that there isn't any negativity going around at all. Of course, that can't be true. But there isn't a single community out there in the gaming world, or really any other activity for that matter, that is totally infallible. It's not just sunshine and rainbows all the time. And let's face it, World of Warcraft is a fully online experience featuring real-life players, and as long as those two conditions are met, negativity will always be present to some extent. But even when you simply compare WoW to other games that fill the same sort of niche, I still don't believe this game is even relatively more toxic than the others. I can only speak for myself, of course, as admittedly a very old and long-time player. So maybe it's different for newer players coming in from other games, and if that is you listening to this right now, I am very interested in knowing what you think about this topic and what I want to go over today. But it's just crazy looking back on the history of the community and my own past experiences. And man, people were freaking ruthless back then. And it's even more crazy to me that it just doesn't add up. It feels like today's community should be more toxic in theory, considering the circumstances we were in as a community back in the day. We had less people playing on servers that stood by themselves. You were playing in an environment where you could actually be called out for stuff on a server-wide level for what you might have said or done within the game. Whereas today, everyone is basically anonymous if we choose to be, and yet I just can't help but feel like the environment we're in right now is just so much more positive overall. And there's a couple of smaller things that you can point to that contribute to this, like the fact that such a huge portion of the community in today's game, as are, as I just mentioned earlier, old as hell, there are disproportionately more dads playing now more than ever. But we're all grown up now. We're adults. And while you can point to a few of those adults here and there that maybe haven't fully left their childhood behind quite yet, I like to think that the vast majority of us are a bit more mature now than we were back then. And I have to imagine that has some sort of impact on how we communicate with each other in the game nowadays. I also think that the shift to a more single-player focused experience, particularly with content like delves or, especially collections actually for that matter, for a really good example, that's a huge one. Like these things have also contributed to a less toxic experience by simply removing some of the usual player interactions from the game completely. And honestly, I think what Blizzard is trying to do with Midnight and all the class and add-on pruning will hopefully further enhance this positive direction that I think we're headed for right now. Making the game more approachable for both new players and even existing players who are just looking to get better could potentially create more positive experiences. But like I said, I think the impact that these factors have, while very important, I do think are a little bit smaller in the grand scheme of things, as far as why I believe WoW is much less toxic nowadays. I think the bigger issue is more so regarding our perception of toxicity, as far as what toxicity actually is, and also where that toxicity comes from specifically. Because here's the truth about toxicity in WoW. I'm not saying this makes up every possible reason for why we experience negativity surrounding the game, but from where I'm sitting, a large chunk of this toxic behavior often comes from the people that don't even play WoW anymore, or even from the people that have never played, for that matter. Social media is just filled with people that try to put all of us down when we are just trying to enjoy the game and have a good time. People that feel like they need to justify their hatred towards the game, whether they jumped on the WoW is dead bandwagon, or they're just trying to make everyone else feel bad because they had a bad experience at some point. And this is very real in both retail and classic. I play both versions now, and I have for a long time, and I see it everywhere. And the loudest voices by far are the people that don't even play this game anymore. players that you will never actually interact with in-game because they're too busy dumping all of their unused mental and emotional energy, and their sanity for that matter, into this behavior. The thing is though, for every bad interaction, there are almost always a few positive ones that will happen in between. The problem is that we as human beings tend to only see the negative over the positive, especially when the positive is very small or seemingly insignificant to us at the time. The worst experiences we have are the ones that stick out the most, despite the majority of our time with others being fairly positive. To be honest, you're also a lot less likely to run into toxicity if you're more of a casual player, like doing low-level Mythic Plus, or even just normal raiding in many cases. And of course, especially if you're just leveling. The leveling experience in both retail and classic is honestly quite good, in my opinion. In my experience, there are many more players willing to help, or at the very least, say nothing at all, I guess, which might be a form of toxicity in itself, I suppose, but those situations are still definitely outweighed by the players who are far more positive, which is especially true in classic as far as the leveling journey goes. The hard truth about all of this is that this is a game that promotes group-based content with real players, and you're going to be rolling the dice. You can't control other people, it's just a risk that you have to accept, and that you have to take if you choose not to run with guildmates or any friends. And I will admit, as I mentioned before, that social media in particular can be quite bad, but that can be said for literally any topic ever. But if you look at just World of Warcraft, the game itself, it's really not as bad as people make it out to be. With all that being said, I want to shift away from the super negative stuff, and there's also not much that I can say that hasn't already been said regarding what you can do to avoid toxic behavior. I've talked about it in a few other videos that I've made. I'll try to link some of those here if you want to go check those out later, but other content creators have touched on this subject quite a bit. And the reality is, the only real solution is to find other players that are looking to accomplish similar goals and are around a similar skill level. Joining a guild or a Discord or whatever, like any other type of community, won't necessarily guarantee 100% positive results, but it is the closest thing to a guarantee that we have. Moving on though, what I really want to shift my ramblings towards now is asking ourselves the question of what even is toxicity? This is a very complicated topic because how do you define toxicity? How do you label a certain situation or, quote unquote negative encounter as toxic? How is that decided exactly? Because the thing is, and this is just my opinion, sometimes situations aren't actually toxic, but are only perceived as toxic. And I think that's a big one that people miss. Like, for example, if a player only wants to build a group filled with other players that have AOTC, or that only have a specific M+ rating, which all of us have been there, we've seen that all over the place. But I'm sorry, that's not toxic. That's totally up to them. They aren't obligated to go about it in a specific way or be forced to play with certain players. And honestly, I'm seeing more and more pug groups and listings with the note of AOTC preferred or AOTC equals faster invite. And I'm seeing those far more often than like AOTC required, or like you need, 20 eye levels over what the raid actually drops as far as gear. And I think there's a chance we'll see even less of this kind of stuff in Midnight if the general gameplay does in fact become a bit more simplified, which, seems to be the direction Blizzard wants to take the game. I have a really good personal example from Classic as well, based on what could kind of be considered WoW code, if you will, and that is what you're quote-unquote supposed to do with BOE blue drops that you might come across in dungeons with other players. For those of you who don't know, the general rule is that when a BOE blue or epic drops, everyone in the group must hit the greed button, no matter what, regardless of whether or not you can even use that item to begin with. Now, there might be some argument here. I know some people say that it's actually everybody must hit the need button, but my point stays the same. It doesn't really matter. I disagree with both. Because here's the question I pose to you now. Is it toxic to need on that BOE blue if you're actually going to equip it immediately as an upgrade? I just find it hard to believe the answer to that would be anything other than no. Or at least I would be very sad if that weren't the case. This also happened to me in Season of Discovery on my Paladin, actually, where some blue bracers dropped in the stockades, and I honestly thought that it came from like a random boss that we killed or something. I don't know, everything looks the same in the stockades. Don't even get me started how bad that dungeon is. But I needed on it because it was an extremely powerful pair of bracers, which are, oddly enough, a very difficult slot to fill in Classic for some reason. I don't know why it's so tough to upgrade bracers, even like with professions, but anyway. So I needed on the bracers. And when I did that, at first everyone in the group was super pissed and thought that I was trolling and thought that I was being toxic. But what ended up happening was the leader of the group actually stepped in and said, "Hey man, it's totally fine, just as long as you equip them right now." Which is exactly what I was going to do and what I definitely did do, because those bracers were ridiculous for me. They lasted until like I was in my 50s. And once I equipped them and everybody saw that I had, everything was fine. There's nothing wrong with needing on a piece of gear if you are actually going to use that item. This especially goes for Classic, but like blue drops are extremely exciting, and so are purple drops obviously for that matter, especially when you find them in the open world. But nowadays, they're no longer exciting because they're a huge upgrade for someone in that group, but rather how much gold that whoever wins the item can obtain by getting it, which is also equally as ridiculous because BOE blues are like worth 5 gold sometimes now in the auction house, which is honestly not even that much by Classic standards. And it's fine and understandable, I guess, if your goal is gold and that's just what you like and that's what you get excited about. But it's just sad to see that the leveling journey, even in Classic nowadays, is just treated like it doesn't matter anymore when it always has. But regardless of how I feel about that situation, it's not toxic behavior to need on something if it's something you can actually use, even if the upgrade is minor. Shifting more back to the retail side of things, another example is there could be circumstances where I'm raiding with a, group of pugs, or it'll be like a smaller guild group and then, the majority of the raid fills up with pugs. And then there will be like boss fights where maybe we're not doing particularly well, maybe we've wiped a couple of times, and then one of the pugs in the group actually like kind of speaks up, in Discord or whatever, and, provides a suggestion. I've been in groups where the leader was like, "Hey man, I appreciate the suggestion, but I think we can do it this way. Let's just try again." And in that situation, it still doesn't work out. And then what that one guy who came up with the suggestion will do is he'll start making the suggestion like in the middle of the fight. He'll start like making raid calls for the raid leader in the middle of the fight. And at one point, it just became too much for the raid leader, and he just told the guy to shut up. Like, clear the comms, just be quiet, and like let me do my thing. In that situation, I don't think that's toxic behavior. Like, you're joining somebody else's group as you are a guest in that guild group. And if you want to make a suggestion, that's fine. If you're not getting clapped back with, something rude or just like something genuinely hurtful, it's not your group. And if you don't like it, just leave. Like, I don't see how that's like, super toxic. And also, speaking of raiding, I think there's also the perception that using like the one button rotation or like, the rotational assists feature or whatever means that you're being toxic. And I think some people genuinely feel that way. And I understand the one button rotation feature and rotation assist can be frustrating for a player who is maybe putting in the work, and maybe it's perceived as lazy, I guess. But also imagine what that person would be doing if they weren't using those tools. For most of the player base that would use those features, whether they truly need them for accessibility purposes or not, is most likely going to be a net increase to their damage. And they can also shift their mental focus from their bars to what actually is happening in the fight. And again, overall, I think the reduction in complexity in this game is also going to be doing wonders to cull toxic behavior. Or, in this case, even behavior that may seem toxic, but actually isn't. There are a ton of other examples that are just like these, where there are players out there that feel like they are experiencing toxicity when I don't feel like it's the case. And I'm sure you can think of examples of your own experiences that you might have had that fit this criteria. But with all of that being said, as passionate as I feel about the points that I'm trying to make here, I do want to make sure that I'm being understanding of where the entirety of the player base is coming from, including those players that may perceive some of the things that I've mentioned so far as toxic. Because listen, we also need to be cognizant of why that could be and why people feel that way. There are many reasons for why someone could be considering non-toxic behavior as toxic, outside of simply immaturity or whatever. People live different lives and go through different things, and maybe what they've gone through in the past has conditioned them to feel like these types of situations are toxic. Admittedly, I've struggled with this a lot over the years, particularly with constructive feedback or criticism. I've been a person who often chooses to avoid conflict at all costs, regardless if the intentions by the other person were good or not. I've understood firsthand what it's like to take helpful advice from someone and treat it like they're just trying to attack me or be overly critical of my decisions. On the flip side, there's also toxic positivity, or, being overly optimistic about situations that might actually not be that great. Like, it's not super helpful as a raid leader to bestow nothing but praise on your entire group 100% of the time, particularly through all the wipes or mistakes. Even if you're not the raid leader and you feel this way, only focusing on the good and literally none of the bad is not good. You can take a step too far in that direction as well, and it's a trap. There are many other examples and experiences that we all have. I just wanted to throw that out there because no one's perfect, and it will continue to be that way. But all things considered, I just don't believe World of Warcraft in 2025 is a toxic game with a toxic community. I think we've come a lot farther than what many realize, and I also think that it's going to get even better. And with all of that being said, I am especially not perfect either, so please let me know what you guys think about toxicity in our community today. I hope this video was helpful. I hope it made sense. And if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching and for all of the support. That's going to do it for me for today. And as always, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.